On the computer, yes. So I'm very pleased to welcome to our service today the Reverend Michael Blair, the new General Secretary of the United Church of Canada. The role of General Secretary is to provide leadership in the direction, management, and coordination of the affairs of the Church in close collaboration with the moderator, the Church's spiritual leader, who is elected every 3 years. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today, Reverend Blair.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for the invite.
So I was reading that you grew up in Jamaica and you were called to ministry as a teenager in the Anglican Church. Is that right?
Actually, more in the Pentecostal church. I grew up in the Anglican church. My mother was quite actively involved in the Anglican parish. She was one of the founding members in the neighborhood where I grew up. And in high school, I went to a Baptist high school and attended a Pentecostal church in my teen years. And it was in the context of being in that church that had a sense of call to ministry. A number of factors came into play, both in terms of high school, the Pentecostal church, and even my Anglican roots. I was confirmed in the Anglican church in 1969.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So your theological journey, I guess, has taken you from the Anglican to the Baptist and finally to the United Church tradition.
Yes.
How did you end up choosing us? United Church is your spiritual home.
Well, so I came to Canada, studied, and was ordained in the Baptist, what used to be called the Baptist Convention of Ontario in Quebec, and served in that church for probably about 20, 25 years, and pastored in congregations in Toronto, St. Catharines, mostly, and struggled for years with my sexual identity. And in about 2001, finally came out as a gay man. And both my local congregation and my denomination didn't quite know what to do with me. So I got kicked out, and in fact, wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And I know the United Church was always an option, but I didn't necessarily want to simply come to the United Church on the basis of my sexual identity. And so I was privileged to work for a community ministry that was supported by the United Church. And in that community, because it was a United Church supported ministry, I was able to attend presbytery, become involved in the life of the United Church, and frankly, fell in love with a United Church minister, and his love for the church really encouraged me. And in some ways, my exploration of the United Church was, here was a community that he loved so much, and he gave me an insight into the church and my own kind of journey of saying, is this a place where I would fit theologically, where I could do ministry? Those came together, and so I started the process of admission.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Quite a journey. Wow.
Yeah.
For the last 8 years, you have served in the role of Executive Minister, Church and Mission Unit for the United Church. So how did that role prepare you for this role as General Secretary?
Well, very much so, because in that role, one of the things I had to learn to do was to manage complexity. And one of the significant part of this role as General Secretary is to deal with the complexity of the life of the church, the complexity of the governance of the church. And so in some ways, and dealing with multiple different things at the same time. And so that role. But I think the role also helped me to do two things. Just got a deeper appreciation for the United Church, and in that role, I traveled a fair bit and encountered people. As soon as they heard that I was from the United Church, there was this absolute excitement. And then there were all these stories that would pour out about the United Church and the impact the United Church had on them. And so it just kind of further deepened my appreciation of this church, which I've grown to love. And as well, it's given me a better sense of the church as a whole, the United Church across Canada. So I think those things I think has helped to equip me for this particular role as General Secretary.
Well, that's awesome. That's
Yeah.
awesome. So, what are your hopes and dreams for the United Church of Canada in the next few years?
So you may remember the comprehensive review that was done, which led to the restructuring of the church. And if you remember the original, the first conversation piece that came out, Fishing on the Other Side. And one of the things that the comp review named was for vibrant, vital communities of faith. And so my dream, my hope, and as I do this work, recognizing that the regions have responsibility for the oversight of communities of faith. But in terms of our governance structure and the work that we will engage is to make sure as much as possible the United Church continues to be vital and vibrant in living out its faith wherever it finds itself in the Canadian context. And so that's critical to me. I also believe that in 2006, at the General Council, at the end of the 39th General Council, there was a prayer that was offered to the church. There was a document called Call to Purpose. And that document sort of talked about the experience of the General Council. You know, it was a council where they dealt with becoming an intercultural church. There's a council which dealt with its commitment to further grow in its relationship with Indigenous communities. And it gave expression of that. And at the end, it offered a prayer. And a line from that prayer continues to capture me, which says, God, lead us into your future, rooted in the richness of our past. Mm-hmm. And so for me, part of my dream is that the United Church will discover, reaffirm the richness of its past, and out of that space, allow God to lead it into a future, into God's future. And so that's my hope. That's my dream. The exciting part is that I don't know what that future looks like, but I do know that God has a future for us. And if statements we've affirmed, our commitment to becoming an intercultural church, Mending the World from 1997, our commitment to being a just, inclusive community, all those things, there is something in those pieces that allow us to kind of live into what God has in store for us for the future.
Amen.
Yeah. I get excited.
Yeah, that's great. Well, at Emmanuel United Church, as you may know, we are proud to have had two trailblazers as ministers, Reverend Dr. Wilbur Howard and Ann Squire, who both served as moderators of the United Church of Canada. Wilbur was the first Black person to be ordained in the United Church of Canada and the first Black moderator, and Anne was the first lay person to be moderator, and she was instrumental in ensuring that Emmanuel became an affirming congregation. So your appointment as General Secretary represents the first time a Black person has served in such a position in a Canadian church, and the first time an openly gay person has been appointed to such a position in a North American church. So does this present an added expectation that you will focus on advocacy for the rights of underrepresented groups within the church and in society in general?
Oh, wow. It's a great question. Let me say, I think in terms of the identities that I bring to this role is in many way a gift, not only to the United Church, but I think to the Canadian context. And so it is important. Representation is important. It's important for people to see themselves. And so for me, I recognize that um, my ability to function in the role that I am in now is important for folks who have been hurt, excluded by the church, to say that there is a place for somebody who looks like me. So I think that is important. I think it's also important to say that the United Church has always been a space that has been a commitment to justice. We haven't lived it fully as we could or we should. So you refer Wilbur Howard, and in some ways we can stand back and celebrate the fact that Wilbur was the first Black person to be ordained in the United Church, that so far he's been the first and only Black moderator. But what we forget is that, in fact, when Wilbur graduated and was ready for ministry, there was no congregation that wanted him. And so in some ways, his ordination came about because the denomination created a space, a ministry opportunity for him in working with a boys club to allow him to be ordained. So, we juxtapose this kind of celebration with the fact that the church couldn't see itself, congregations couldn't see itself time having a Black minister in those days. So it's that kind of juxtaposition. And what I want to do, I think, there's a temptation, and I think people may feel nervous that as a Black man and as a Black gay man, that will be my only issue. What I want people to understand and hear is that I want to call the United Church to be its best self. And the United Church has been this place that has been committed to seeking justice. And so I want to say that we need to continue to seek justice. We need to continue to name, our experience with the Indigenous communities as demonstrated to us that part of the healing has come about because the church was prepared to apologize to Indigenous communities. And that apology meant that the church had to be honest about its history and its life. And out of that space, was able to offer an apology and start a new way. And I just want to nudge the church that we need to continue to do our work around the inclusion of people of color, Black folks. We need to be honest about our history with racism and anti-Black racism in particular. And we need to understand that even our work of becoming affirming, that we don't end up in a space where we say we're affirming congregations or we're affirming ministries, but we never kind of grow into that. So it feels like we have reached a point rather than it's a starting point to a journey. And so my hope is, let's be the best of who we have identified ourselves to be. And let's work at these issues, and let's recognize that it's not a destination, but it's a journey.
Yeah. It's a big
Yeah, it's a big
big
question.
journey.
Yeah,
It's a big journey for
yeah,
sure. Yeah.
yeah.
In the scripture reading for today, God makes a covenant with Abram and Sarai that they will be rewarded for their faithfulness by becoming the parents of generations to come. It's very familiar passage. The legacy of Abraham and Sarah has influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All three religions have been inspired by their arduous journey, the hardships they endured, and the blessings they were given by God. What do you think the lessons of this story say to us in our current context?
So, in some ways, I think a couple of things I would say. First of all, that Abraham and Sarah were prepared to risk. And in our current context, we have to we have to know that we're called to risk. And part of that risking is to give up our expectations of the way things are supposed to be. Part of that risking is that, we have to move from our comfort zone. Abraham and Sarah were asked to go on a journey, right? And to leave the familiar. And so I want to think in terms of this COVID times. And the reality in this COVID time is that we haven't been able to be church the way we understood church. And we haven't been able to be in our comfort zone. And I think in some ways we're lamenting that we have lost. Abraham and Sarah didn't keep lamenting. They risked and moved.
Mm.
And so for us, the question is, how do we, in this time, learn to risk and move? And part of that risking and moving is that how do we move from our comfort place to this new space that we don't know, right? It's fraught with uncertainty. It's fraught with, I don't know what's going to happen. But Abraham and Sarah risk. I think one of the other things it says to me is that, Abraham and Sarah in their own way trusted the encounter they have with God. And, the interesting thing about their particular story was that they, at least the narrative talked about kind of immediacy. They had conversation with God. God appeared to them. But at the end of the day, they trusted God. And so for us, I think for today, what does it mean to trust God? Can we trust God? And can we trust that, we affirm Sunday after Sunday that, we're not alone. We're called to be the church. We celebrate God's presence, who has created and is creating, who has come in Jesus. So can we trust that God is still creating in the now? And like Abraham and Sarah, we're prepared to trust and to move, that God is at work in our circumstances and in our situation. And so we kind of celebrate that. And I think the third thing I would say that their story has for us is the recognition that they understood that the God thing was about a relationship. And the thing that I love about this story is that there is a rawness and a realness to the way in which Abraham deals with his conversation with God, right? He talks to God, he listens, but he's not so sure. Or even Sarah, Sarah overhears the angel saying she's going to be pregnant. And what did she do? She laughed. Like, me in this old body of mine, you think I'm going to enjoy it? That there was a relationship of honesty. And I think for me, the story reminds us risk, trust, and work at relationship. So those are some of the things that come to mind when I think of that text.
Beautiful. Thank you. Finally, In this changing time of learning new ways to be the church in a virtual world, what is your message to Emmanuel and to other congregations?
So I was, not that I've thought about this before, but you know, I have a friend that I get together with virtually weekly, and I keep saying to him, "What if this is as good as it gets?" And he, you know, he struggled with that. But one of the things you know, even last week when I was chatting with him, one of the things he says, "I'm learning to embrace." And so, what I would say to folks is, stop thinking about what used to be, and stop dreaming about when we're going to be back together and see each other and do all the things we usually do. Stop and embrace the now. So how do we make the best of our life together in this virtual space? How do we embrace it, engage it? How do we learn how to be together? Um, I think COVID and virtual worship and virtual gathering has caused us to kind of think about what does community mean? What does community look like, right? So how do we cultivate community when we can't be together, right? But you can't do that if you keep pining for what you have lost and hoping for what you've lost will come back. It has something to do with in the here, in the now, in this particular moment. How do we rise to embrace the circumstances we're in? I think I'm a Baptist, so I think in threes. So my second thing to folks is not only just embrace, but I think it's to say, where is God in this moment, in this time? What is God saying to us in this time? And I think that's personally and communally. So I think that's a journey for each of us to kind of think about it. So where is God at? What is God up to in this moment? And I think I just want to encourage people to say that's a question that we need to be asked and engage in. And then the third thing I would say, remember that it's not all about you. And one of the challenges I think we have faced is that we are so concerned about that we can't be together, and we're finding ways to be together that we forget that there are people outside of our community who still need to know care. There are people outside of our community that are struggling. There are people outside of our community that are more fearful than we are. You know, I think about the fact that there's so much concern in the news, and I guess all of us, we think the vaccine is going to solve all our problems. But in some ways, and you know, there's this anxiety now that we're not getting vaccines fast enough and all that kind of stuff. But what about the folks in Zimbabwe who have no access to vaccines? You know, what are so that there are parts of this world where, because of economic systems and powers, they don't have access to vaccine. How are we in this time when we are shut away advocate that it's not all about Canada hoarding all those vaccines, but Canada needs to be concerned about those countries that don't have access to vaccines? How do we respond to the fact that there are refugees who are caught because of travel? They're in places where their lives are at risk, they need to come. They've been approved to come to Canada, but with travel restriction and all that kind of stuff. So how do we remind ourselves that there are folks in very scary position? Or how are there ways that we could? So we know that in this particular time, issues of gender-based violence has gone through the roof. Um, and it's not just women and children who are experiencing that, who we've said shelter at home, but home's not a safe place. How do we think about that? But also think about the young gay man whose family is intolerant of him, and he has to be at home in that place of intolerance, or the transgender person, so as we are in the space, let us also think about those, not just ourselves and wanting to be together, but let's think about those who are at risk. And is there something we can do? Like, we're at home now, we can shoot a letter off to the government. We can shoot a letter off to our mayor, we can try and lend some voice and let people know that we are concerned and we care. So that I think is an important thing for us in this time, and that would be an encouragement that I would nudge us to think about.
Thank you so much. You've given us lots to think about, and we really appreciate your presence at our service virtually. And we thank you and God bless you in your role and in your journey, and be safe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.